Hey guys, what's up? My name is Public, and today I am bringing you the Legion Patch 7.1 Shadow Priest Guide. Now, I did do one of these for 7.0.3, however, a lot of things have changed, so I figured I might as well just readdress them in a new guide to help clarify a few things. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into the changes between when I made that guide and now to kind of get a baseline of what things have changed. So one of the biggest things that we've gotten back is shadow form, so now we do need to essentially use shadow form for everything. We don't no longer are in it by default. There were some numbers and balance changes with this, but essentially everything is worked out as a DPS neutral change. So essentially the only difference is we now have to have a weak core to track when shadow form is active or not. So that really doesn't change, what we're doing or how we're doing it. And outside of that, Shadow really hasn't changed too much in terms of raw numbers or rotation or that sort of thing. One other small thing to mention, Blood Elves can now use Arcane Torrent to generate Insanity. So that's kind of interesting, but other than that, that's about it. The main reason to make this guide is not necessarily that the patch has changed, but since we've had it longer, we kind of know where Shadow's groove is and where to essentially place Shadow and how to build it to essentially do the most DPS for raid and PvE environments. So before we get started, I'll let you kind of skip around to the different sections here in this video. The first thing we're going to cover is just a Shadow Priest 101. How does the class work? What does it do? What's it good at? That kind of thing. And then we're going to move on to the talents and then into rotation, both for things like Legacy of the Void and Surrender to Madness. And finally, we're going to close off with gearing and artifact stuff in general. So kind of first off, what is a Shadow Priest? Well, Shadow has changed a little bit since its previous incantations. We're essentially bound to a new resource called Insanity, and our goal is to get as much Insanity as we can up to a certain point. Then we can activate something called Void Form, where we do just massive amounts of damage for a period of time until our Insanity drains back to 0. So our abilities are kind of tied to either gaining Insanity for us or essentially holding out time for that thing to drain once we're in Void Form. So we have kind of two sets of abilities, and some of them are only usable in Void Form. So our idea is for the spec to maximize our damage is to stay in Void Form as long as possible throughout a fight. And I'll kind of walk our way through how we're going to do that and how you can do that in this video. Alright, so let's go ahead and start off strong. Let's go ahead and start looking at the talents for Shadow. So we don't have a whole lot of options right now, so I'll kind of handle the cookie cutter-ish build for Shadow in raiding environments. Starting off with the level 15 row, we're going to take Twist of Fate no matter what. Talent is just way too strong to consider anything else. Next thing we're going to look at is Body and Soul. This is essentially mandatory again. It's a nice movement CD. Especially when you're not in Surrender to Madness, so you don't have to worry about dying. The next row, we're going to look at Mind Bomb. It's going to be pretty much our default choice here. Having an AoE stun is amazing, and if you are lucky/unlucky enough to get the Cephas Secret Legendary, you can use Mind Bomb to proc that as well. So it does have some light synergies as well in terms of DPS, but only if you have that weird Legendary guy. Alright, so next row we have two main options here, that is Void Lord and Reaper of Souls. These guys kind of come into play more with our level 100 row talents, so I'll kind of hold off talking about these guys in just a second. Next row we pretty much only have one option in terms of rating, and it's going to be Auspicious Spirits. Now if you have really low levels of crit, you can consider taking San'laeon instead. And when I say low levels, I'm talking about majority like under 15% crit. San'laeon is probably going to be better than AS on pure single target. However, that being said, AS is just going to scale better the more targets you have. So even if there are like 3 targets and you only have 14% crit, AS is still probably better. And then the other weird corner case, if you have the legendary belt that affects how many charges of Mind Blast that you have, playing around with Shadowy Insight might be beneficial. It's kind of in the same light as San'laeon, where it doesn't fit every case, but on pure single target it does look like it's doing better, but not by a huge margin. So again, AS is probably your default for most cases. Our level 90 row, we only have really one option here, which is going to be Power Infusion. Power Infusion just scales really well for us, and more importantly, it helps us stay in Void Form a lot longer than Mindbender can right now with our gear. So For the most part, we're going to be taking Power Infusion no matter what, especially with our level 100 talent, which for the majority of fights is going to be Surrender to Madness. We also have another option, Legacy of the Void, but its use is it's a little diminished now just because of how much it's outshined by Surrender to Madness. And if you're unfamiliar with the spell, Surrender to Madness essentially lets us stay in Void form a lot longer by making our abilities generate more insanity. So we can stay in Void form, up to 2 minutes or even higher with Surrender by following specific rotations. So it's just a massive DPS gain for us right now, and it's one of the reasons why Shadow is doing so well in raids. So with that being said, if you're taking Legacy of the Void, generally speaking, Void Lord is the talent that you pair with that. And then on the other side of that coin, Reaper of Souls is the mandatory talent you take with Surrender. The synergies with these two is just really, really nice. So this is your kind of starting baseline for Shadow Priest right now. So that pretty much covers the talents for the most part. The big beef of this is kind of working at your rotation and getting that down to a certain point. For all intents and purposes, we pretty much have 2 or 3 rotations, or kind of priority lists, if you want to call it that. Our first one that I'll kind of touch is the out of Void form rotation. So this is when you're just generating insanity, trying to get into Void form as fast as possible. So with this guy, you want to prioritize using Mind Blast, 1 charge of your Shadow Word Death, not both, and then you want to apply your dots, and then you can use your filler spell after that. Filler spells in this case are pretty much going to be either Mind Flay or Mind Sear. This can also continue, like dotting new targets can count as a filler. And you can see this graphic that's been up that's kind of illustrating this a little bit. You can kind of replace Mind Flay with any of those fillers that I just mentioned. And the only reason we're only using 1 charge of Shadow Word Death is because we want to have both of them for when we're in Void form, so we can essentially maximize our time in it. And that's kind of the whole idea of the class. So now, well, you'll ask, Sean, I'm in Void form now, what do I do? Well, things get a little bit more complicated. We gain 2 more abilities, mainly Void Torrent and Void Bolt. Both are used exclusively in Void form. Void Torrent essentially just pauses our insanity to a certain degree. We're still gaining stacks and that sort of thing, but we don't have to cast anything. We're just channeling a spell, and it's kind of like a freebie time to help us get more stacks. So the priority list is going to look something a little similar. Except we're going to cast Void Torrent on cooldown. We're going to cast Void Bolt on cooldown, and then we're going to essentially follow the same priority list that I gave you before with Mind Blast into Shadow Word Death, where now we can use both charges. And then we're going to throw up our dots on new targets. We shouldn't have to redot our primary target. Void Bolt should do that for us, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. And then again, our filler spell kind of applies in the same direction it did in the out of Void form section. And so the idea here is to essentially keep following this priority list, and then you're good to go. Void Bolt's cooldown is something you do want to consider here, though. When your haste is below a certain threshold, which is about 130%, you're going to want to essentially cast 2 spells in between every Void Bolt to essentially get the maximum output out of it. And then once you kind of go over this 130% haste mark, you want to do Void Bolt, filler Void Bolt. So only 1 spell in between every Void Bolt. And this essentially is how the rotation is going to work, and you won't really hit this 130% mark until you're using Surrender to Madness with higher stacks, but you will kind of sort of notice that rotation change a little bit at that point. This pretty much covers that rotation. Now, if you're confused with, how do I know when my haste is that high or that kind of thing, there's a weak core linked in the description below. It's Twin Top's Insanity Bar, and this essentially tracks how much haste you have, how many stacks you have, and all that good stuff. So you can find that and all my weak cores in the description to help you out with that guy. So now that we understand the basic rotation for Shadow in terms of Void form, out of Void form, and that kind of thing, we can start talking about how Surrender to Madness changes this. Because it does change it slightly, and moreover, it's pretty much just how we're going to be using our cooldowns effectively. So I'm putting up this graphic now. It's trying to lay things out in a perfect world scenario to a degree. This isn't like far and beyond like always do this every single time, but this is a good guideline. The idea with Surrender to Madness is you want to stay in Void form as long as you can. For a lot of people, that's going to essentially kind of hard cap out a little bit over 100 stacks. And that's kind of where you want to aim for, is to kind of be in the low hundreds-ish. And by following what you see here, it's going to essentially help you get there consistently with almost regardless of what your haste value is right now. To do this, you're kind of at minimum looking at close to 10,000 haste, but that could change slightly based on your other gear, like how much crit levels you have for AS procs, and believe it or not, also things like how much lag you have, like what your MS is and how fast you can cast spells. But the idea is you want to cast Void Torrent, on cooldown, and then with that, follow your normal priority list in between these. And so essentially, if we look at one of these perfect scenarios, let's say 2 minutes is our goal, which is 3 Void Torrents, which isn't unreasonable. It's kind of hard to hit this in a raid environment right now with our gear, but as we get closer and closer, and to kind of propel the longevity of this guide, I kind of wanted to make this a long-term thing. So this is kind of what you want to shoot for. You should be able to do this on a dummy, like a target dummy, but whether or not you can do it in raids is kind of more up to you. So again, like I said, you want to kind of cast Void Torrent on cooldown, so we're looking at once every 60 seconds. So we should be able to pop it right at 1 as soon as we hit Void Form, and then we can pop it again at 60 and again at 120. I've added a little bit of variance here in case you pop it a little late, which is fine. It just kind of delays things out a bit more. And then the main points I want to look at here are just the cooldowns that we have. So the main ones being Dispersion, Power Infusion, and Shadow Fiend. Shadow Fiend really doesn't help us stay in Void Form at all. It's a lot of damage. So the idea with Shadow Fiend is you want to use it as late as possible without dying because you didn't cast something that generates insanity. For most people, this is a point 8 seconds after you pop Power Infusion is like the best time to do it, or with Lust, because that's usually your highest point of haste at that point. So that's why you see I have Shadow Fiend here at 93 with Power Infusion at 85. Now the reason why I put Power Infusion at 85 stacks is, generally speaking, if you can wait to pop Power Infusion until 85 stacks, you're almost guaranteed getting to that third Void Torrent, assuming everything else lines up. So your goal with this guy is to delay Power Infusion as long as you can, to essentially help propel you forward. Now the other oddball in this case is Dispersion. So you can use Dispersion, generally speaking, twice within Surrender of Madness for a pseudo DPS game. When I say DPS game, it's not really, you're not gaining any damage by casting it, but you are prolonging your death with Surrender, which is technically an increase in damage. So if you really need it, you can cast Dispersion twice. The first time you'd want to do it is immediately after your first Void Torrent, as you can see here. But in my opinion, only do this if you really, really need it to get above 100 stacks or even above 120. If you're not really hitting either of those 2 points, then it's probably better not to use it. Personally, I don't use it here. I prefer to save it as long as possible. And for me, this usually happens right as soon as Power Infusion expires. So after Power Infusion is done, I usually cast a couple spells, and then I'm like, okay, I have hit the point of no return. I'm about to die. But I want to cast my third Void Torrent, so what do? That's when you can use Dispersion to essentially delay you further. As you can see here, I've used it right before I cast my third Void Torrent. And that's kind of what you want to do. Save Dispersion as long as you can, and this will help you stay in Surrender, as long as you can without losing damage. Now the one thing missing from this graphic is your Shadow or Death usage. The other really important thing to stay in Surrender to Madness as long as you can is smart Shadow or Death usage. Well, what do I mean by that? Essentially, it means that you don't want to go trigger happy on Shadow or Death. You'll have 2 charges available to you, but you don't just want to go, trigger happy, like, oh yeah, I gotta use it, both stacks right now. For the majority of things, only use Shadow or Death if you need it because you're about to die. That's kind of your goal, especially for your second charge. In general, for DPS reasons, it's fine to use one of them and just leave one off cooldown. And then, and that point will probably start needing that just one charge around 50 to 60 stacks. And then at that point, you can kind of keep with that. Now, once you use Power Infusion, you really don't need Shadow or Death. I know it's going to kind of feel like you do, but with Power Infusion, you're generating so much more insanity. Shadow or Death isn't as necessary. You can pretty much keep yourself alive with Mind Blast, Void Bolt, and the occasional Mind Flay as your filler. So then, again, it comes down to using Shadow or Death as smart as you can, and only using that second charge when you're at the brink of death and you have no other options. At the end of this video, I'll include an example of hitting this third Void Torrent with this strategy, so you kind of see the decisions I made and what I did to hit that. So yeah, and that pretty much covers our surrender rotation for the most part. So we can go ahead and talk about gearing and the artifact pathing and stuff like that. You'll see the artifact path coming up here now. Credit goes to Melgain and everyone at How to Priest that put this guy together. This is kind of the default path that everyone's been following since the expansion launched. And the idea is you can see 1B over there. That's the point where we want to hit our first gold trait, which is Mass Hysteria. I mean, this is like a 20-30% DPS increase, so getting this first is crucial, and it's super important. Past that, everything's just icing on the cake, but for the most part, you can just follow this graphic and you'll be just fine for there. Alright, so as far as getting gear, we have essentially a couple different paths that we can follow. For Legacy of the Void and Surrender to Madness, we use what's called stat weights to essentially help figure out what's an upgrade and what's not an upgrade. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to put up these Surrender to Madness stat weights now. If you want the Legacy of the Void stat weights for like a dungeon set or whatever else, that will be linked in the description with everything else. And then as far as stat weights, like I said, in general, they're used to help us find upgrades. So we can use something like Pawn to say like, oh hey, Pawn's showing that this item is a 5% upgrade, I know to equip that. Essentially, this replaces having to sim your character every time you get an upgrade to see if it's an upgrade. Pawn kind of takes some of the guesswork out of that. If you have questions on how to use Pawn, you can check out my video that I did on that a while back. But as far as these three stat weights that you see in front of us, they're not essentially geared to getting your third Void Torrent necessarily. It's moreover getting out the most DPS possible, not only in just Surrender, but also outside of it. So what you have here is kind of like different areas of haste. So we have 8k, 10k, and 12k haste. The idea is you want to shoot for somewhere in between 10 and 12, and that number might vary just based on your comfortability with the spec. So for most intents and purposes, you want to be using the 10k haste stat weights around 9k haste. Then you can start shooting for it, and that'll essentially help you so you're not overshooting and getting too much haste, and not, you know, passing out crit or mastery gear that might be an upgrade purely from a DPS standpoint. Because crit and mastery really benefit us outside of Void form and outside of Surrender, more importantly, which is generally speaking where we spend a good chunk of the fight anyways. So we're not trying to optimize ourselves just to be getting, you know, our best Void Torrent possible, or best Surrender times as possible. So use these three weights accordingly. So if you don't have 8k haste yet, use the 8k weights. Or if you don't have quite have 10k, like you're sitting at like 9,000 haste, something like that, then start using the 10k. At some point, you'll just by probably not until Nighthold, you'll get to, you know, haste levels where it's like, yeah, I have 12,000 haste, but I mean I've been using the 10k weights, which is essentially valuing it less. At that point, haste just drops dramatically. It's almost right where intellect is, and then you can use the 12k weights. So for most purposes, you're going to be using the 10k weights for now and for a considerable amount of time as well. So, and if this at all changes, like I said, this is being recorded at the 1st of November. So if this changes, the description will have the updated weights and the link to the explanation on that. So kind of going along with gearing, there is that always age-old question of trinkets. I don't really have a clear-cut answer of what's good and what's not. Things to aim for are, generally speaking, trinkets with haste on them are usually pretty good for us. In addition, some other like World Quest trinkets like Devil's Sword Shock Baton, Unstable Arcano Crystal is really good as well. And then some of the dungeon trinkets are also pretty decent as well, such as Oak Hearts, Gnarled Root, and Neuraxis Spike Tongue. Still doing a lot of trinket work and things like that, but for the most part, if you get a trinket, my advice is to essentially try it out yourself on a target dummy or on a progression night for raids, and just see what's working out best for you. And keep in mind that eye level makes a big deal here. So if you have an 895, say, Bow of Corruption from Xavius, it's probably going to beat out an 830 Devil's Sword Shock Baton. That's not always the case, but when an eye level disparity is extremely high, usually the higher one's going to fare better for us as a class. So just something to keep in mind. So the last thing I want to kind of cover in this guide, kind of going along a bit with rotations, now that we have everything kind of cleared up, is how do you know when to pop Surrender to Madness on a raid boss? As we're about to see, I'll show you my my 2-minute void form with 3 void torrents here in just a second. But in a raid setting, how do I know when to pop it? Well, if you've been looking at the raid footage that I've had in the background, you notice I have a little time to die weak aura on the kind of middle left of my screen. Kind of estimates how much longer the boss is going to live for in minutes. So the idea is, on a dummy, let's say you're practicing Surrender, trying to see how good you can get. And you can get on a dummy about 100 stacks. That's what you can do. Well, then you know when this week where it says around 60 seconds to a minute, so about minute 40, minute 45, you should probably pop Void Form because that's what you've done at your best. You can kind of lower that or add to that to see how much you can push yourself, but that's kind of how you know when to pop it for you. It's not always going to be when the boss is at 35%. It's not always going to be when the boss is at 50%. It's very dependent on how comfortable you are with Surrender and how high you can get with Surrender in terms of that. And then continue to push yourself based on that. Now, if you're having trouble practicing, you notice Shadow or Death is a pretty important part of our rotation, so not normal target dummies really won't work for us. Things you can use that I've used myself is something like the Garrison dummy from Worlds of Draenor, which you can see in the video coming in just a second. You can also use the PvP dummies in Ogremar. I'm not sure if there is one in Stormwind or not. I don't play Alliance, sorry. And then you can also use the Trial of Crusade, whatever, dummies, PvP dummies in Northrend, as well as technically the Lich King can be used as well, because he has that period phase where he's just doing RP stuff, but he's still hittable, so you can technically test on that if you feel so inclined. And those are kind of your options to do that. So that is my main suggestion, to practice as much as you can, and that will essentially get you the best output possible. Okay, guys, so this pretty much wraps up the guide for Shadow right now in 7.1. So I hope this has explained everything. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I try to get to as many as I can. And if you're interested in more Shadow content, just stay tuned to the channel. We'll have more coming shortly. Alright, guys? So enjoy this third Void Torrent kind of example for you coming right now. Thanks.